Well, we all know, don't we, the reasons why the United States intervened in the Gulf the way we did. In the end, killing between 100,000 and 200,000 Iraqis, as opposed to 303, I think, Americans killed either in combat or in combat-related accidents. And we certainly have restored to power the legitimate authority in Kuwait. In fact, we've done it applying that age-old, all-American political principle of one man, one vote. In this case, one man, the emir, one vote, his. We heard Bush back in August, didn't we, at the very beginning saying that our way of life was at stake. We had to do something about that invasion of Kuwait. We also heard, didn't we, besides the way of life was at stake, we had to intervene to protect the access to the energy resources of the Persian Gulf. Another one was that we had to stop naked aggression. What we did not get are alternative interpretations of the events that occurred. And that's what I want to speak about here tonight. It's my opinion that the United States needed an international crisis, an international threat, to replace the crisis in Europe that largely disappeared with the collapse of communism and the chaos in the Soviet Union. Why? In order to keep the permanent war economy going, to justify continuing the situation wherein well more than 50% of the federal budget goes to military purposes. Well, this means that the military expenditures in the United States are the motor of the U.S. economy, and they have been that ever since about 1950. It's worth reviewing the history because that's where this crisis, I think, comes from, this sought-for, needed crisis. In early 1950, there was extreme worry at the highest levels of the Truman administration that the United States was likely to return to the conditions of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so early in 1950, the decision was taken that this domestic economic problem was going to be solved through militarism. That is, through rearmament in the United States and through U.S. financing of the rearmament of Western Europe, particularly Western Germany. The document which provides the analysis of the world at that time and the U.S. place in the world and the internal situation in the United States was top secret for 25 years. In 1975, it was accidentally or through error released and published. It is known as NSC 68. It was written by NSC, standing for National Security Council. It was written by Paul Nitze, and it is a very detailed document. The main operative conclusion, though, was this. This is a quote from the document. The United States and other free nations will, within a period of a few years at most, experience a decline in economic activity of serious proportions unless more positive governmental programs are developed. Well, the solution adopted, those more positive governmental programs, was expansion of the military. But Truman could not get this program through Congress at first. There was opposition there and public opposition to the enormous new taxes that this program would require. He went on national radio, declared a state of national emergency, and said what Bush's remarks about our way of life being at stake reminded me of. He mustered all the hype and emotion he could, and Truman said, among other things, he said, "Our homes, our nation, all the things that we believe in are in great danger. This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union." In his speech, he also called for massive increases in military spending for U.S. and European forces, quite apart from the needs in Korea. Well, there was no threat from the Soviet Union. They were still rebuilding from the rubble of World War II, in which they had lost 20 million people. They were no threat, but they were manufactured from 1950 on, from the time of Korea on, as a grave threat to the United States. And that became the justification for this program, which Truman, through manipulation of the Korean War, had been able finally to get through Congress. The result was that in the first 2 years, that is the 2 years between 1950 and 1952, the U.S. military budget more than tripled from $13 billion in 1950 to $44 billion in 1952. And during the same two-year period, U.S. military forces doubled to 3.6 million people under arms. This was the beginning of the permanent war economy in the United States. The Korean War, by the way, went on for 3 more years after it could have ended. In the end, 34,000 U.S. were dead, more or less, more than 100,000 wounded, and the total casualty count was in the millions. It is worth recalling that because from 1950 on, the Soviet threat was the justification for the permanent war economy and the justification for these enormous military expenditures. What does that mean as far as the United States is concerned? Well, it means that we have not addressed or begun to solve the many domestic crises that we all know exist. There's no need really to go through this litany of the worst educational system in the developed world. 1 in 3 in this country illiterate, either totally or to the degree that they cannot function in a society based on the written word. Healthcare, not just the cost, but the fact that 40 million people in this country have no health insurance. The only developed country in the world with no national health plan. And on and on. The fact that only about, 60%, about 2/3 of the eligible voters register to vote. And of those who register, only about 80% actually vote, so only in the end, 50% of the eligible voters vote in national elections in this country. And that means that a president is elected with around 24-25% of the potential vote. The litany goes on: the environment, the infrastructure, finding a prevention and cure for AIDS, the violence we see everywhere and in every form in the United States. When you put all these things together, I don't think anyone would argue, add drugs, of course, anyone would argue that we have a domestic society in profound crisis. And the reason why over all these years these crises have not been solved is, in my opinion, because those who really control and rule the United States don't want them solved. Imagine what would happen if we had an informed electorate, if we didn't have the worst educational system, if we had a negligible, perhaps, illiteracy rate here. There might be an informed electorate. We might be debating real substantive issues in the electoral process or in the political process in the United States. There might be a threat in this country of real democracy if we solved the domestic crises in this country. People might clamor to participate if there was a real debate. There might be a threat of a third party, I mean a second party in the United States. There are all kinds of threats to elitist control of the United States if we were to solve these domestic crises, in my opinion. And it is for this reason that we have always needed this foreign threat and this foreign crisis in order to justify putting the money into military expenditures instead of converting the economy once and for all to human purposes. During those 40-odd years of the Cold War, the CIA has been a very important factor or tool or instrument of the President of the United States in waging what is continuing today. This new world order of George Bush, or new international order, seems to me to be nothing more really than the institutionalization of the north-south dimension of the old Cold War. That is the war against the Third World for control of their natural resources, their labor, and their markets. Factor or tool or instrument of the President of the United States in waging what is continuing today. This new world order of George Bush, or new international order, seems to me to be nothing more really than the institutionalization of the North-South dimension of the old Cold War. That is the war against the Third World for control of their natural resources, their labor, and their markets. That is where the fighting really took place, as in Vietnam. This North-South dimension of the Cold War, the war against the Third World, continues today as we sit here with all its racist content. And we and our allies, that is the United States and its allies, are just as dependent, if not more, on the resources of these countries in the Third World as they ever were. And that dependency is not going to disappear. It's going to keep on growing through the years. So what I think Bush has in mind is, through this Persian Gulf crisis, to send a message to any aspiring Third World leader that Third World radical nationalism will not be tolerated. It is a way in which, in fact, we are beginning to treat the Third World, or continuing to treat the Third World, like we treat Third World people right here in the United States. They know their place, they have a role to perform, and they're expected to do it. If they don't, if they make trouble, they're going to be smashed. That is what happened, of course, with Iraq. I believe that Bush encouraged the Hussein administration and Saddam Hussein himself to believe that they could get away with taking over Kuwait with impunity. And there are many signs that point in this direction. Iraq never really formally recognized the independence of Kuwait. They have always claimed that Kuwait was part of Iraq taken away by British imperialism, which is indeed the case. Last April, Assistant Secretary of State John Kelly testified before Congress that the United States had no commitment to defend Kuwait. On July 25th, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, meets with Hussein. Among other things, the U.S. ambassador says to Hussein, Mr. President, I have a direct instruction from Secretary of State Baker to emphasize to you that the United States has, quote unquote, no opinion on your disputes with Kuwait, particularly your border disputes with Kuwait. She also said, I have an instruction from President Bush to seek better relations with Iraq. President Hussein, in response, in several places, says that what Kuwait is doing through its overproduction is the equivalent to war against Iraq. They are destroying the Iraqi economy, he said, and we are going to take strong action. He as much as said that they were going to go to war. Well, in this meeting with those 100,000 troops on the border, not one word from the U.S. ambassador of warning to Hussein not to invade. Well, put all those things together, and you have to ask yourself the question, why did the Bush administration do nothing during that last week between the ambassador's meeting with Hussein and the invasion itself to prevent that invasion? They knew those 100,000 troops were there, but not one word from Glaspie to Hussein about it. My conclusion is that they wanted the invasion, that this was the site selected for the new international crisis that would justify continuation of the war economy in the United States. It was totally avoidable, objectively speaking, but because of the tradition in the United States, after all, we are a warrior culture. We do still live in the age of imperialism, and the demands of this system require this crisis. I go back to the CIA for just a moment because it's worth recalling that the agency from the very beginning in the 1940s, was used not only to collect intelligence from around the world, process it and present it to policymakers like the President for their decisions, or to help them in their decisions. Obviously, that's what an intelligence service should do. But the CIA was used all through these years to subvert the democratic processes of other countries. At the very first meeting of the National Security Council, which was set up in the same law that established the CIA as the National Intelligence Service, this was October 1947, 1 month after Truman signed this bill into law, establishing the CIA and the National Security Council as the highest policy-making body in national security and foreign affairs. At their very first meeting in October 1947, the decision was taken to set aside $10 million for the CIA to intervene secretly in the Italian elections coming up about 6 months later. The CIA was not just used in these electoral operations. You know, the media operations were vast, and I'm sure they still are. Media operations basically means that the CIA pays a foreign journalist to publish the CIA's material as if it were the journalist's own. There were CIA interventions of all sorts, but one area I want to mention of special importance are what are known as liaison operations. Liaison operations are all those activities that the CIA undertakes with the intelligence and security services of other countries. Early on, the CIA began to set up security and intelligence services in other countries for purposes of internal security. One of the first places was Greece. There was a civil war, you know, in Greece, 1947 to 1949. The United States intervened on the side of the far right in Greece, and the U.S. side won. In the aftermath, the CIA set up a security service known as the KYP, or KEEP, KYP being the Greek initials for CIA. They gave it the same name. This security service was used to keep the far right in power in Greece for nearly 20 years. But when that power was threatened with upcoming elections in 1967, the CIA and this service, this KYP, organized a military coup in Greece, which was successful, leading to 7 years of military dictatorship in Greece, of neo-fascist stripe. During that period, torture became an institution in Greece. Thousands of Greeks were forced into exile. I could give you many, many examples of this. In Iran, for example, in 1954, the CIA, 1953, the CIA undermined the democratically elected civilian government of the day of Mohammad Mossadegh, overthrew that government, installed the Shah as military dictator, and in the aftermath set up a service called the SAVAK. This service, over the 25 years of the Shah's regime, became famous for its torture chambers and its assassinations of the Shah's political opponents. 1954, the U.S., the CIA, intervenes in Guatemala, undermines the civilian government, the government is overthrown, and from 1954 on, Guatemala has had one succession of military rulers after another, a military dictatorship. In the aftermath of this operation in 1954, the CIA set up an internal security service, and then others. But from these services set up and supported by the CIA all through the years came intervenes in Guatemala, undermines the civilian government, the government is overthrown, and from 1954 on, Guatemala has had one succession of military rulers after another, a military dictatorship. In the aftermath of this operation in 1954, the CIA set up an internal security service, and then others. But from these services set up and supported by the CIA all through the years came the death squads. In other words, the services established by the CIA then spawned these death squads in Guatemala. The very same thing in El Salvador. You can be as sure as you are of your own name that for the last 10 or 11 years the CIA has been working in there day and night with those Salvadoran security services and military, collecting information, giving it to those services, which in turn are the same things as the death squads, information on activists in the human rights field, the student leadership, trade unions, and so forth. And those have constituted the 75,000 or so people who have been murdered over 10 or 11 years in El Salvador. Disappeared, many of them, others tortured to death, their bodies thrown along the sides of the roads. Nobody knows how many have been killed in Guatemala by these military regimes, which started with the CIA. Some say 100,000, some say 125,000, some say 150,000. Who knows? Nobody will ever really know the exact number who have been killed. But you multiply this around the world, because I'm only mentioning a couple of examples of these CIA operations. There have been now 44 years of this, and they have existed all around the world. And put those operations together with the overt military interventions and the enormous cost in human life of those, such as Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Vietnam, for example. All of those, and you get the picture of this expansionist, extremely aggressive U.S. foreign policy. Well, I don't think it's enough really to describe what the CIA does or U.S. foreign policy in general. It's also necessary to ask a couple of questions. And going back to the Gulf for just a moment, consider this analysis of what really happened in the Gulf. You know that the United States has been exporting war materiel for decades, beginning right around 1950 with the document I mentioned earlier. Tanks, guns of every sort, weapons, planes, ships, and military equipment of every sort. Well, with a national debt of $3.5 trillion in this country, 800 billion of it owned by foreigners. For handling of that debt, it seems that it was only a matter of time before the U.S. armed forces were sent abroad as one more export. Because what we did in the Persian Gulf crisis was to send abroad that enormous amount of military hardware, but this time we also exported the people to operate it. It was armed forces sent abroad to protect the resources and the regimes, these family dictatorships of the sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf. What we did, in fact, was what we in the United States do the best. We made war. And we were financed in this exercise by the people who make things that people around the world want. Cars, VCRs, and so forth. Financed mainly by the Japanese and the Germans. And that puts the United States, as it's going to have a permanent presence in the Persian Gulf, in a very strong position vis-a-vis the Japanese and the Germans, who are not there militarily. And they are going to depend to a great degree for their energy resources, at least from that region, on U.S. policy. That is why they went along with the war. That is an interpretation of the Gulf crisis. And the other question that I wanted to raise is why we do these things as a country. Why we do these as a society, as a nation. Why do we do these grisly things abroad? I believe strongly that until we have fundamental change in the United States, domestically, in the domestic system, until we have some kind of real democracy in this country, participatory democracy, where people have a say, and where we end the re-election of 95 to 97% of incumbents at every election, where there is a real political debate. Until we change the domestic system, we're going to have elitist control of the United States. We're going to have these foreign adventures and the grisly things, as I mentioned, that the CIA does abroad. So the real problem is here at home, in changing the domestic system, in bringing about a conversion of the economy to human purposes, solving the domestic crises, and getting the people out of office who are in there to back a continuation of the permanent war economy.